Hi, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to transform existing fabrics into a really cute side tie skirt. There's no sewing machine required for the whole tutorial, so we're going to do it all by hand. These are the things I'm going to be using. So I've got a pattern master, but you can use any ruler, a sharp pair of scissors, some thread, some hemming tape. This stuff is really cheap and it's going to save us loads of time. A needle, some clips or just normal sewing pins. I've got some pieces of A3 paper that I'm going to tape together in order to make the pattern, some sellotape and a pen, and then I've got a skirt, this is one of my skirts that does fit me, and I've just laid it out here to show you the shape of it, and I'm going to use this to make the new pattern for my new skirt. And then finally, my two favorite parts here, which I'll hold up to show you. This is a piece that I got from a car boot sale for £1, that I'm going to use for the fabrics. I really love the detailing that it's got, and then I've got a contrasting cord that I'm going to use to make the side ties. So I'm using this piece because it's also got a lining fabric as well as the sheer outer embroidered layer. So if you've got two separate pieces, so for example a sheer fabric and then a lining fabric, they don't need to come from the same garment. I just luckily found one that did, but it's a 2-layer skirt. The first thing to do is to tape together some paper. So I've just done sellotape lines down the back. I'll lay it flat and make sure the size you've made is slightly bigger than your skirt. So if you lay your skirt down, there should be a bit of a gap around the edge. So mine looks like this, and I've laid it as flat as I can within the paper. The next thing to do is to trace around the shape of your skirt. So the way that I do this is I get my pen and I do a line of dots just along the outside, so you can see what it looks like here, and then we're going to join up these dots afterwards, and I'm going to do that all the way around the edge of the skirt. Okay, so now when I remove the skirt, I've got my basic outline. At this point, you can use your ruler to fill in any straight lines. So the edges should be straight. And then the curves, I'm gonna do freehand. So I'm gonna just start at the top and do a nice curve, joining up my dots. And the same on the bottom. Next is to add the seam allowance to make sure when you cut it out, the actual fabric is slightly bigger than the size of the final skirt that you want. So my existing skirt fits me well, so I'm going to do a 1 centimeter seam allowance. If your existing skirt is too big, then don't do any seam allowance at all and just use this as your final pattern. And if your existing skirt is too small, then you want to do a 2 centimeter seam allowance to make the final piece slightly larger. So I'm doing 1 centimeter. So along my current lines, I'm just going to add a 1 centimeter marker all the way along, and the same on my curves. And I'm going to continue to do this all the way around. Once again, and I'll join up these dotted lines to get my final shape. We've only just got enough space on this piece of paper, so feel free to stick on some more if you find actually you need it to be a bit bigger than you thought. So I've now got my 2 lines, and I'm going to cut out this with paper scissors following the outside line. And my shape is ready. Now we need to label our pattern so we know all the details relating to it. So firstly, we need to mark the grain line. So the way I'm going to do that, because we have a symmetrical pattern, I'll fold it in half and just make some teeny tiny folds there. And then on the front of the pattern, I will use my ruler to match up those 2 points and mark. So this will be our grain line. The other labels that it's important to have, firstly, are the name of the piece this actually is, so you know when you're flicking through your patterns what this design actually is. So I'll call this A-line mini skirt, and the size it is, so this one is a 14. This piece will be the front and the back of our skirt because we're using the same pattern for the front and the back. So I will write front and back panel. If you had a piece that used multiple different pieces of paper to make up the pattern, then you'd say that this was piece number 1 out of say 3. But because we've only got 1 piece in this pattern, I'll say that this is piece 1 of 1. And the last thing is to label how many of these you will cut. So because we've got a front and the back, I'm going to cut 2 of self, and self means the fabric that will be on the outside of your garment. And secondly, I want 2 of these for the lining. So cut times 2 lining. And that is my pattern labeled. So this is the gorgeous piece that I'll be using to make the skirt, and I'm just checking that my pattern is still going to fit. So I want 2 self and 2 lining. So I want 2 of this outer sheer fabric and then 2 of cut out of the lining fabric. The outer fabric and the lining on my dress are currently still attached together. So to make my cutting out life easier, I'm going to separate out these 2 by just cutting along this seam. So I'll do it as closely as I can to the sewing line, and you can cut it at this stage rather than spending a long time unpicking, as we're not going to need the full width of this fabric. I'm ready to cut the first panel, and this one is going to be the most important one, as this is going to be on the outside of the front of the skirt. The grain of this fabric goes vertically, so in order to match it I would have to put it this way around. However, fabric isn't quite big enough for my pattern, so I'm going to have to do a 90-degree turn, which is just the nature of upcycling. You have to adapt sometimes to the material that you've got. But I'm going to pin this on and then get ready to cut it out. Now I'm going to cut along the outside of the pattern. So here's the piece, and we need 2 of these, so I'm going to now use the back of the original dress in order to cut out exactly the same one. I'm now going to use the lining of the dress to make the lining of the skirt. So we've cut 2 self already, and now we're going to cut 2 lining. So I'm using the inside of the dress, and I'll lay out the pattern and cut it out exactly as I did before. All 4 pieces are now ready to go. I've got 2 times lining and 2 times self. This is the front, and this will be my back. Here are my 2 pieces of lining, and our first step is to sew these 2 together to make one long strip. So I'm gonna fold one over onto the other, so I'm doing right sides together. Line up these 2 edges, and I'm going to use some small clips to attach this edge together. You can use pins as well. Both work exactly the same. I just prefer to use these. To get ready to start sewing, I've got a needle, a thread which I've matched as closely as I can to the colour of my fabric, and I'm going to cut an arm's length of the thread and then push it through the eye of the needle. Okay, and then bring the tails down so they're about, one is about this much shorter than the other, and I'm going to start sewing along this line, and I need to stay 1 centimeter from the edge of the fabric as that was our seam allowance. And I'm going to start at the bottom here, and I'm going to start off my thread by over sewing about 3 times in the same place. So starting at the edge of the fabric, I've got my 2 layers here. I'm going to sew in and out, pull my thread through, and leave about 1 centimeter left over at the end as a tail, and do the same thing, over sewing in exactly the same position, making sure that I still don't pull that tail through, and one more time. And on this final one, before I completely pull the thread through, I'm going to put my needle through this loop here to create a knot with my thread. And now the start of my thread is secure. And you can cut this bit of excess tail. And you want to start as closer to the edge as you can, but as long as it's within that 1 centimeter seam allowance, it's going to be caught when we hem the edge of this fabric. So now I want to do a line of sewing all the way down the edge in order to join these 2 pieces together. And I'm going to use a back stitch, which is quite a quick but secure stitch. So I'll go into the fabric a few millimeters along and then back out again. So I've gone in and out 3 millimeters apart, pull my thread through. Now, because it's called back stitch, I'm going to go back to where the end of this visible stitch is and go in, and then I'm going to see where my thread came out last time and move another 3 millimeters along, push my needle through and pull the thread tight again. And now we'll continue this all the way along. So I'll do another few slowly just to demonstrate. So it's back stitch, so I will go back to where the end of my previous stitch was. I'll see where my thread came out and I'll move another 3 millimeters along the line that I'm sewing and pull that thread through. And you want to make a line of stitch like this all the way along the edge of the fabric. So I'll go in where the end of my previous stitch was, leave a gap where my thread has come out, and make another hole 3 millimeters further along. The aim is to then continue this line of stitching all the way along to the top of the skirt. I've now sewn all the way along this seam and I'm ready to finish off my line of stitching. So I will do exactly the same as we did at the start and over sew 3 times on this last stitch. So I'm going to go in and out. That's 1. In and out again. That's 2. And then on this 3rd and final one, before I pull my loop all the way through, I'm going to thread my needle through that bit of thread and pull it tight to form a knot at the end, and then trim that thread. And if you run out of thread on your needle before you reach the end of this seam, that's fine. You can just complete one of those ending and restarts further down, get a new bit of thread, and then restart and continue to the end. I'm now going to do the same thing but with the outside layers of fabric. So this is my outside fabric and I've sandwiched together the 2 right sides. So I've got right sides together, the front and the back, and then I have clipped together this side, and I'm now going to stitch down this side just as we did with the lining. If your fabric is quite thin as well, these lightweight ones can be a bit trickier to handle sometimes. So take your time and make sure you're catching both layers of fabric and not pulling your thread too tight so as not to pull the fabric itself, so it will still sit nicely when we've finished. And I'm going to continue the back stitch once again 1 centimeter from the edge all the way along where I've clipped the 2 layers together. This is the outer 2 pieces, the front and the back. And the next thing we're going to do is sew a hem along the bottom of the skirt. And we're going to do a double fold hem, and I'll do a close-up to show you how to seal these stitches. But firstly, what I'll do is I'll go along and do 2 double folds, 5 millimeters on top of each other, and then clip them down. So I'll do 1 fold and then a second one, and I'll seal that with a clip. And you can do the same thing with a pin as well. It would have the same effect. And I'm going to do that all the way along. Again, this is quite a light fabric, so it won't sit completely flat, but you'll be able to manipulate this with your fingers as you go back along and sew it down. So this is all of the clips ready to go, holding down my double folded hem. And now I'm going to show you a blanket stitch that we're going to use to seal this edge. So this is the edge of my newly folded hem, and we're going to start off. I've threaded a needle with the same thread, exactly the same as before, and I'm going to start off this hand stitching line again in the same way by doing my over sewing. So I'm on the inside of the fabric where my folds are, and I'm going to do 3 over sews. So 1, 2, and then finally 3. And then before I pull this loop all the way through, I'm going to thread my needle into it to make a small knot on the end, and I'm going to remove that so it's out the way. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to do a blanket stitch. So basically we want to sew down this hem but not be able to really see it on the front. So how a blanket stitch works is you do a tiny stitch through all the way to the other side, like so. And then along the back, I'm going to make a jump of about 1 centimeter. So I'm going to make sure my hem is still folded. I'm going to make a jump, actually let's do about 5 millimeters. And then again, go all the way through, in and out, and pull that along. So I've got a long stitch on the back and a really short stitch on the front that you'll hardly see. And I'm going to continue that all the way along. So I'll do a few more examples. I've done my tiny stitch in and out, so now I'm back to doing a longer stitch. Like this, and then a teeny stitch, just catching all the way through to that front piece of fabric and pulling it tight. Okay, so I've got long stitches on the back, tiny stitch on the front, long stitch on the back, tiny stitch on the front, and I'm going to continue this all the way along. This can be a bit fiddly because you want to make sure that your fabric stays folded. If I had a natural fiber, I would iron this down, but this fabric is just going to melt if I try and iron it, so I just have to hold it as I go. So I'm making some progress here as I move along, and I'm really happy with how this looks on the front. You can see the teeny tiny stitches where I've caught all the way through the fabric, and then on the back you can see the longer stitches. And I'm going to continue this all the way down. This hem is now complete, and I've sewn it all the way along the bottom of the skirt, and you can see close up it's a really nice finish that you can hardly see on the front at all, but it's just going to keep that hem from fraying at all at the bottom. We're now going to do the same thing along the 2 sides, so up this edge and up the far edge as well. Starting at this bottom corner where I finished my previous line of stitch, I'm going to double fold this edge so I'm ready to sew it again. So I'm going to fold it over once and then twice and seal that in with one of my clips. You can do the same thing with pins. Both work just as well. I just prefer these clips. And I'm going to do this all the way up the side and then sew it down with the blanket stitch once again. All of the edges of the self fabric are now hemmed except for the top, which we're going to use to attach to the lining. So to start prepping the lining, I'm going to first press it so it's nice and flat to work with. The next stage is to hem the lining on the same three sides. So this side, the bottom, and the left-hand side. And to make this one a bit faster, because it's a more stable fabric, we're going to use a hemming web, and I'll show you how to pin that in place before we iron it on. This is how to use the hemming web. So roll out your 1 centimeter wide hemming web along the hem that we're looking at, and then fold back 1 centimeter of the lining onto itself. So the hemming web is sandwiched in between, so it goes lining, hemming web, lining, and then use pins specifically to pin that into place. So choose a pin that doesn't have any plastic on it, because we're going to stick an iron on top of this afterwards, and you don't want to be worrying about melting any plastic. So continue this all the way down, sandwiching the hemming web in between the two layers of your lining, 1 centimeter wide. Once you get to the corner, cut off the hemming web so it's the same length as the lining, and just seal in that final corner like so. So starting now on the curved edge, I'm going to start in this corner where I just finished and sandwich in the hemming web like this. Remove the last pin that I placed in, and then fold over so all 4 layers are caught inside, and pin that down. So it looks nice and neat like this. And then continue the curve all the way along, and the hemming web will curve, you just sort of have to manipulate it with your fingers as you move around. All 3 of my edges are now pinned, so I've moved over to the ironing board to seal the hemming web in. So the way this works is you're going to iron over this folded hem, and the hemming web will melt and become like a glue and stick these 2 layers together so that we don't have to sew the whole thing. So the key here is not to get the hemming web on your iron, as that's going to melt and get really sticky. So whenever you're going along, you want to just make sure that the hemming web is tucked under your hem. So you can move really slowly at this point, you're not in any rush, and as you get to each new section, you can iron on top of the pin, that's completely fine, as it's only metal there, so you're not going to damage it in any way. And just place your iron on, and then the hemming web is going to slowly start sticking these layers together. And as I go, I just move this down so you can see it, I'm just going to press with my fingers to make sure that the hemming web is completely sealed inside the 2 layers of fabric, and continue that all the way along around the 3 edges of the skirt that I've pinned. Using extra steam at this point is really helpful, as that's really going to activate the hemming web as you go along. And you can also remove the pins as you go and just run back over with your iron to make sure the web is really well stuck down. My self piece and my lining are now ready to get put together, and oh my gosh, the skirt's starting to come together and I love it so much already. This fabric is so nice. I've now laid out my 2 layers, so I've got my outside fabric facing down and then sandwiched together with my lining fabric, so I've got wrong sides together, so my nice finishes are on the outside, and I'm going to pin together the short side at the top, which is going to be the waistband. We're going to do another double fold hem, and I'm going to start in the middle of the top and then work my way outwards just to make sure both sides are even. So I'm going to fold back that hem in the middle and match it with the hem on the outside fabric, and then do a nice double fold down, a 1 centimeter once again, and then pin that in place. You can use your pins or your clips now, because we're going to be hand sewing this rather than using any hemming web or the iron. So that's nicely done, and then I'm going to do the same thing, match up the 2 tops and work my way around, making my 1 centimeter double fold hem. This can be a little bit fiddly, so just take your time as you work around, as this is going to make your life so much easier when you're hand sewing it in a second. I finished pinning down all of the waistline with my double fold hem, and we're now going to hand stitch with a back stitch again, which was the same one we used for this middle seam in order to finish the waistline. And then the skirt is nearly done. We're going to do that and then sew on the ties, and then it's finished. So for sewing this section, we're going to start off in a similar way. I'm going to cut the thread and thread my needle. But for this line of stitching, I want it to be even stronger. So I'm going to sew with a double strength stitch. So I'm going to double up my thread. So usually I would say that you leave one thread longer than the other, but in this case I want to match up my two threads so they're the same length at the end and pull that tight. And then when I start off, I'm going to again do my over sewing as usual. So I'll do one, but when I'm doing it this time, I'm going to keep both tails so they're not pulled through. So I'm going to use a double layered stitch and keep those two tails still, once again not pulled all the way through. So that's 2 stitches, and here's my third one. I'm going to have 2 threads during my whole line of sewing. I'm just going to move back towards this edge. Just while I'm at the start, I'm also going to just do some extra stitches along this piece on the end just to make sure it's already sealed in. So I'm just going to go in and out and work my way up to the corner. And this is just going to make sure that no ends are going to come out and nothing will fray, and your skirt's going to just look really high quality. So I'm happy that this corner is really secure, and now I'm going to show you once again how the back stitch works. Just because we've got a double thread this time, so it might look slightly different. So I'm going to look at the outside of my fabric because this is the line of stitching that we're going to see, and I want it to be nice and neat. So I'm going to first do a normal stitch in, and then come out around 3 millimeters further along, just making sure they're nice and in line. And you want to make sure that you're catching all the layers on the other side that you want. Pull that tight. Just check you've got no knots on the back. Because you've got a double thread, it is more likely to knot at the back, so just make sure you're checking each time. And then to continue my back stitch, I'm going to go back to where the end of my previous stitch was and come out 3 millimeters after the end of my last one. So I'm going to continue this line of stitching all the way down, pulling it through, checking the back. Got a slight knot, so I'll just pull it out. Now it looks nice and flat, and then I'll go back to the end of my previous last stitch. Just check that it's perfectly in line because you want this to look really nice as it will be visible on the front of your skirt. So you can see the line of stitching is beginning, and I will continue this all the way along. The final part of the project is to sew on the side ties. So I've got a bunch of this old cord, but you can use any kind of ribbon that you've saved, and you just need to decide where you want to put them. So I've decided I want to do 3 ties equal distance down to the halfway mark of my skirt, and I want them to be about 15 centimeters long. So I've just put this on and sort of wrapped it around my body and decided how long I want these to be. You can always cut them longer and then shorten them once you've sewn them on if you want to adjust them. Once you've cut your length, so we need 6 of these because I want 3 ties and 2 on each one. Where we're going to sew this in is to sandwich it in between the lining and the outer layer like this, and we're going to sew by hand 2 small lines here to secure it down. Start off your needle and thread doubled up inside your cord and over sew as usual 3 times, and make sure not to pull both your threads through the end. And then on the third one, thread your needle both those 2 loops. Now our anchor thread is ready to start, and I'm going to position this where I want, just tucked in 1 centimeter into the lining, and I'll pin that in place. I'm now going to do a few tight stitches just up and down this line. This is my first line done, and I'm going to do a second line just parallel to it, so it's double strength to make sure it's super secure. I finished off the thread and I'm happy that this is now nice and secure, and I'm going to repeat this process 5 more times with my remaining ties, so I'll have 6 in total. So I've sewn on my first 3 straps, and now I'm going to match it up with the other side and pin in place my next ones to make sure that they're at the same level when the skirt's closed. I'll then sew on those second 3 and then the skirt's done. The skirt is now ready to try on, but one final step, my straps are woven in a way that means that they're not going to fray, but if you have a ribbon or something and these ends are starting to fray, what you can do is take the end and fold it over once and then twice, and then run a small stitch along here just to seal in that end to stop it fraying. I love it so much. I actually can't get over it. The colours, the texture, the little contrast side tie. It's so